Colleagues, welcome. My name's Colin Lindsay, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first of the PrOPEL Hub International Research Webinars. This is the first of a regular series of international research webinars that is being hosted by the PrOPEL Hub project, supported by UK Research and Innovation. You can find out more about the PrOPEL Hub at propelhub.org. In this first webinar, we are absolutely delighted to welcome Jari Hakanen and Janne Kaltiainen of the Finnish Institute of Occupational Health to talk about employee well-being before and during COVID. I'm not going to give these two excellent researchers too much of a build-up because we have a short amount of time, but I urge you to seek out their important research. Before we start today's webinar, a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to stop talking in a moment. There'll be a presentation for maybe 35-ish minutes, and then there'll be lots of time for questions and answers. The chat function is disabled, but you can type questions into the Q&A function, which I will then support our speakers to respond to at the end of their talk. This is being recorded, and we also encourage you to take screen grabs and screenshots if you want to. The research, Jari and Janne's research, is actually brand new and is embargoed until February 9. So please, if you're taking a screenshot, please keep it private until February 9. And the recording, if you want to go back and listen again, will be available after February 9. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Jari and Janne to talk through these very interesting findings on employee well-being before and during COVID, evidence from Finland. Jari, Janne, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Can you see it now? Is it okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Colin, and a very good afternoon from snowy Finland to everybody. We are very happy to present these very fresh results. Actually, you are among the first people that will hear about this. Some of our colleagues and bosses at the Institute have heard something about them, but you are really the first people to hear our very recent findings related to employee well-being among the general population in Finland. My name is Jari Hakanen, and we will share the talk with my very dear colleague, Janne Kaltiainen. We have worked intensively together with these projects and other projects too. So now I first give the floor to Janne.
Thank you. So let's see. Okay, now I got the control of the screen as well. Yeah, and thank you for the invite on my behalf as well. We are happy to have this opportunity to share our results and discuss with you these interesting and rather timely findings. So let's first start off with some context of the COVID-19 situation in Finland. Let's see if the slide changes. Now the slide changes, at least for me. Hopefully it did so for you as well. So in general, the COVID situation has not been as bad as in many other countries in Finland when we look at it in terms of infected and people who have been hospitalized or unfortunately have died. But of course, there has been a wide-ranging impact in general, restrictions for social gatherings, for traveling, or for working at office, which of course we are all familiar with. And as an example, in spring of 2020, the schools were closed throughout the Finland and access to daycare was restricted. And interestingly, amongst the European countries, in Finland, we had the highest number of employees who switched to telecommuting or increasingly telecommuted in the spring of 2020. This is according to a survey by Eurofound. So over half of the Finnish participants responded that this was the case for them, whereas the average in Europe was a bit over third of the respondents. And this resulted, according to the Statistics Finland, official numbers that around half of the 1 million employees telecommuted in spring of 2020. So some of our results are also about whether people telecommuted or not. So just to give you some context on that. And next about our research project. So in a bit over a year ago, by the end of 2019, we collected a random sample from the Finnish population of people who were employed, and they were aged from 18 to 65. So this data was collected before COVID-19, and of course at that time point we did not have any idea that what would happen in the following spring. So it was done for a different project and for a bit different purposes. And in this survey we measured employee well-being, different dimensions, which I will shortly introduce next in the next slide. And so after we collected this random sample from the Finnish population, so that was in December 2019 and January 2020, then the COVID-19 happened in spring of 2020, and we realized we have this quite nice opportunity to do a follow-up survey to the same respondents, and we did that in June 2020. So that was the second survey, and now we had the opportunity to conduct a third survey to the same respondents again in November, December, so just a few months ago. So this is really fresh data, and also our analysis are quite fresh. So we are happy to present them to you. And this resulted in a 3-wave longitudinal data of 757 matched respondents over time, and these were people who were employed at all of the 3 time points. Okay, so this is quite strong setup given that we have a baseline before the COVID-19. So this was so-called researchers' luck, perhaps, that we had just done a data collection in a different project. So by this, we are able to examine the development of well-being in comparison to the baseline, and also the results are statistically weighted in terms of age, gender, and residential area, so to enhance the generalization of the findings to the Finnish population. Okay. So shortly about the concepts that we will be looking at, that we have studied. So here's a figure of different dimensions of well-being at work, and it can be divided either by negative and positive. On the negative side, we have, for example, boredom and burnout, and on the positive side, we have work engagement and job satisfaction. But in addition to that, they can be also distincted by the level of arousal. So work engagement is a positive well-being dimension characterized by being energized, enthusiastic, happy. So it's a high arousal state, whereas, for example, job satisfaction, which is also positive, but it's characterized by being calm and relaxed. So it's a low arousal state. And then we have the antipode of work engagement, namely burnout, which is a negative side, and then also the job boredom. And to give you more precise definitions, work engagement is a positive, affective, motivational state experienced at work, which is characterized by vigor, dedication, and absorption. And from several thousands of studies, we know there are several positive outcomes that follows work engagement at work, such as health and motivation and performance. And then on the negative side, we focus on burnout, which is a prolonged stress syndrome characterized by exhaustion, mental distance, and cognitive and emotional impairment. And just I'll shortly mention that this is a quite new burnout measure that we have applied in this study. And in this case, burnout is defined through these 4 main dimensions or symptoms. And then we also look at job boredom, which is quite interesting aspect and perhaps a bit less studied, or it is actually less studied than engagement and burnout. And it refers to an amotivational state due to understimulation and lack of challenges. So how these three dimensions have developed over time during COVID-19 in Finland. Okay, let's first look at the findings in the general working population. So here we have the three well-being types. First, work engagement, then burnout, job boredom. Then we have the mean levels at all three time points. So the time points are in the below bottom side of the screen. So there's the 2019 December, then the second one is June or summer 2020, and now the latest third survey by the end of 2020. And as we can see, the changes are not huge, but they are mostly statistically significant depending on which change we are specifically looking at. But as we can see, work engagement actually increased during the first COVID-19 time span. This was in the spring of 2020. So, but it decreased back to the same levels as before COVID-19 by the end of 2020. And for burnout, we do not see similar changes across the first time span, so the spring of 2020, but by the end of last year, there is slight minor increase, but only really small, but indication of slight increase. But for boredom, the increase has been more substantial, as we see that it increased across the first time span and also now across the subsequent time span from summer to fall 2020. So people have increasingly reported being bored at work. And as I mentioned, we have defined burnout through these 4 different symptoms in the new burnout measurement scale that we have applied. And interestingly, we see that exhaustion, so being exhausted, not lacking energy at work, it actually decreased across the first time span, so spring of last year, and now all of the symptoms have slightly increased by the end of last year, especially cynicism towards work, or so-called mental distance, have increased since the summer of 2020. And looking at how work engagement and burnout has developed and perhaps differed between groups of managers and then non-managers or employees, we see that in both groups engagement first increased, then decreased, and for managers their well-being has been better as work engagement is at a higher level at all 3 time points and burnout at the lower level. So this is the orange line, whereas the green is non-managers, and also slight small indication of increases in burnout amongst both groups. And let's see, the slide didn't change yet now. So this is quite interesting result that when we look at different age groups. So we have 4 age groups. First one is under the 36 years old, which is the purple darkest line in the figures, and then we have 36 to 45 years old employees, then 46 to 55, and then 56 and over, which is the red line. And here what is quite interesting is that especially the youngest age group is having least amount of work engagement and experiencing the most burnout in comparison to other age groups. And also the change trends have differed a bit. In the last spring, there was no initial increase in work engagement amongst the youngest group, and it has decreased similarly in all of the groups across the fall of last year. And the burnout during the last fall increased, especially for the youngest, so the darkest line. So this is a quite worrisome trend that needs to be taken into account when it comes to Finnish population. So these are pretty much a short summary what I have already said. So work engagement decreased back to the same levels as before COVID-19, slight indication of increases in burnout, whereas boredom has increased across all 3 time points. And then there are quite worrisome trends amongst the youngest age group, which I just talked about. So I think it's time for Jari to pick up from here and talk more about the well-being at telework and how that has looked like in Finland.
Thanks a lot, Janne. Yes, now we focus on those who moved to telework last spring and have continued to do so mainly until the rest of the year, and then compared to those who have kept on working at the offices or their workplaces, so they have been in touch with other people, not mainly working at home. And here we see that as regards to work engagement, you may see that the first phase of the year meant that work engagement increased considerably, one could say, among the teleworkers, but then in both groups, teleworkers and non-teleworkers, it decreased by the end of last year. But still, the level of engagement is still more or less at the same level as it was before COVID-19 among teleworkers, where it's slightly worse, slightly lower among those who have not been teleworking. Then burnout, we talk a lot about burnout during COVID-19, and here we see that among teleworkers, nothing much did have changed. And then as regards non-teleworkers, burnout level has now increased slightly during the second half of last year. And perhaps the most striking finding is then this increase in job boredom in both groups, but particularly among teleworkers. In Finland, I launched the term telework apathy, and I'm not so proud of this term, but it has become quite popular in Finland, so it seems to catch some of the experience that people have now felt when they are constantly working at home. So everything is basically okay, but it's not so inspiring, it's not so motivating, it's a bit boring to work only via laptop. Then we also investigated changes in some work characteristics, and there are both positive and negative changes, again comparing teleworkers and non-teleworkers. And you may see that around half of the teleworkers reported that they have had more autonomy at their work, and they have had more skill variety, possibility to learn new and better work practices than earlier. And then there is a decrease in support from supervisors and from colleagues. Perhaps the figures are not that high, so it's like every fifth have reported less support from their supervisors and every third less support from their colleagues. But these figures are higher than among non-teleworkers anyway. One striking feature is that teleworkers have reported less breaks during the workday, half of them, which is a challenge in this Teams and Zoom world. And then about work to family and family to work conflict, we see that there is a somewhat higher figures among teleworkers than among others, but again, these figures are not particularly high. They are higher, slightly higher among those who have had children at home, which is the case also without the COVID situation. We did some statistical modeling also between time 1 baseline situation and time 2, and there we see that interestingly, increase in telework meant that it meant a decrease in social and organizational resources, one could say, support from coworkers and identification with one's workplace and fair practices, which meant decrease in well-being, that is decrease in engagement and increase in burnout and boredom. But on the other hand, then this increase in telework predicted more autonomy, more learning new work habits, more task level resources, one could say, which on the other hand balanced the situation so that it meant increase in well-being. So this explains partly that the changes in well-being are not that big among teleworkers. At least part of the explanation can be around here. Then some people have suffered more from telework than others. Here we compared those who live with other people, children, partner at home, and single household employees. And we can see with these single household people with the orange color, orange line, that already at baseline, the level of engagement is lower, burnout is higher, boredom is higher, and the difference has deepened during the past 12 months, so that the engagement has decreased more than among those who live with others, and burnout is also now more prevalent among them, and as well as job boredom is strikingly higher among those who live by themselves. And this is of course a big challenge for companies also, what can be done for this when people have less and less social contacts at work, but also perhaps outside the working day. Here is the summary. Perhaps I don't repeat them. You'll get the slide and the video later on to focus more. But then conclusions and one more result, as there may be many and there are many different things that have impacted well-being during this very strange year. Here we used dominance analysis, statistical method, compared 16 different possible predictors of employee well-being, and tried to find out, relatively speaking, which are the most important factors now impacting engagement, burnout, and boredom. We had characteristics related to demographics, we had occupational factors, background factors, then we had questions about tele and close contact work, and then we included 3 work characteristics: justice, organizational identification, to what extent do I identify with my workplace, and then job insecurity. And we focused on changes in employee well-being. So what happened to engagement, burnout, and boredom between the 6 months follow-up period, between before COVID-19 and 3 months after the outburst of COVID. And we can see that changes in work characteristics. Here we looked at what happened to justice, identification, and insecurity between 6 months. Did they increase or decrease? And we see that these 3 changes in work characteristics explained more or less 2/3 of the changes in employee well-being. So this is a clear practical message also. So what can be done to maintain, to keep the sense of justice, to keep people identified with their companies, and to decrease the sense of insecurity seems to be highly valuable things, so that people stay engaged and do not bore out or burn out at their work. And concluding remarks. Although we report now, and with Janne we tell about changes, so we can say that the overall changes can be considered relatively small thus far. But the situation has worsened in late autumn compared to first part of the last year, and especially the well-being of youngest age group below 35 years old, we think it's worrying. And forced teleworking may be detrimental, especially for employees in single household, but it's also noteworthy that we should not forget about non-teleworkers, because also their well-being have deteriorated during the past 12 months. And then very briefly, the practical message, perhaps we can discuss that more. We think on the basis of our research and research done by many others, and also before the COVID-19 period, that kind of servant leader orientation, human-oriented leadership, staying in touch with colleagues, social support, giving feedback to oneself, but also to others. What I have achieved today is very important to stay engaged. Discussing joint purpose, what's the meaning of all this work now that I only work at home, only via laptop. Learning new challenges at work, perhaps this could be the moment to have time to learn new things and that way to get inspired and stay engaged at work. Then recovery issues during the workday is a big challenge, but an important way to stay well at work. And for your information, we may tell that in addition to this population data, we are collecting similar pre and during COVID-19 longitudinal data from 7 different Finnish organizations, and the sample size is much bigger there, and we also cover many more topics, different kind of resources, different kind of demands, job crafting, adaptability, and things like that. And now and here you can see that Finnish is actually much more simple than English. Thank you, you need only one word, kiitos very much.
Kiitos to you too, Jari and Janne, if I pronounced it right. I think I did. That was a very informative and very helpful presentation. I'm going to read off some questions that we've gathered, and I don't think I'll do them in any particular order. I'll do it very democratically as they've come in, but maybe before we talk about some more issues of substance and on what to do, I think you're quite right, Jari. We should maybe move the discussion to what does this mean in terms of workplace practice. But before we get to that, I have a few questions that have been asked on the question board around some of the definitions and language. Not everyone is a psychologist in this call, so maybe you can
Sorry.
No, that's why it's very informative. So, for instance, in terms of defining cynicism in the context of a burnout symptom and hypothesizing or speculating on why cynicism in particular might rise during a COVID event or a period of isolation and telework. Can you talk a bit about what you mean by cynicism, how it's defined, how it's measured, and what you think is going on when we see a rise in cynicism?
Yeah, okay. Cynicism here is part of the traditional definition of burnout. So burnout is traditionally defined as consisting of exhaustion. So you are chronically exhausted. Holidays will not help you. And then cynicism is a kind of, here it's kind of a coping mechanism. When I'm so exhausted and I have problems in concentrating, remembering things, I may lose emotional control. I get these strange outbursts of emotions, negative or whatever, starting to cry at a meeting. So cynicism is kind of a coping mechanism here. I detach from my work. This is not so important. I don't care about my colleagues, my clients so more. So it's kind of a consequence, not so much directly perhaps from COVID-19 situation, but it can be a result from getting exhausted. So if you are exhausted, then according to the burnout theory, the cynicism may start to develop later on. But we did not see much change there. It was more about exhaustion so far. The time lag is also very short for other dimensions of burnout to develop, I would say.
Feel free to add, Janne, or I'll move on to the next question. Okay.
Yeah, okay. Not much. I think Jari covered what I had in mind as well. It's like some of the items that we used are, I feel indifferent about my job, or I'm cynical about what my work means to others. These kind of sentences people have evaluated when we measure cynicism.
Okay, that's great. Patricia asked about the definition of boredom here and the extent to which you have control variables for people's normal day-to-day psychological state. She says, have you control for general boredom in your day-to-day life? And could this bleed in to one's experiences of working life? I don't know if this says anything about Patricia's own feeling of boredom on her day-to-day life, but can you define those terms, and is there a need to control for broader psychological conditions?
Would you like to reply, Janne? Or?
Well, yes, about the definition of boredom, it's feeling that the time moves really slowly during the workday. It's about, we also use the item I feel bored at work, and it's also about that your mind starts to wander around during the workday, so you don't stay focused. And these are the essential, perhaps, what's in the essence in that construct. And of course, here we perhaps come, if I understood it correctly, to the quite perhaps tricky how to differ the general something and the work something, especially now that we have moved, or some of us have moved to home, working from home, so we don't have a separate office anymore. So of course you can be less bored during your leisure time that at work you do. So I think it makes sense to measure job boredom and see how you feel during the working day. But I'm not sure, perhaps Jari, you can continue and fill in if you have some thoughts.
Yeah, I think before job boredom was started to study seriously in research, there was this concept boredom proneness, that you are kind of a personality characteristics, and indeed we did not control for that, but still I think that I have been very happy that we included this job boredom here because of the results also, and it seems to be so many people, at least in Finland, describe their feelings that corresponds well with this job boredom idea, that it's a loss of significance and it's kind of a motivated state. It's not a motivation like what comes with burnout, but it's more like coming from understimulation, mainly from understimulation. Perhaps it means that you cannot meet your colleagues, you don't see people, you only work via one laptop, all this. Perhaps people cannot do all the tasks that they normally would do. You have to give up some, or then you have workshops via the Zoom and Teams, all this, that it means kind of understimulated state. Then we know, we have done this research earlier also, that also it can result from overstimulation. And I think this also may correspond with present work life among people who telework, so that if you have all the day, throughout the day, team meetings, Zoom meetings, you may be overstimulated kind of, and that does not necessarily burn you out, but it may kind of increase your sense of boredom. But that's a good point made by the participant. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Oh my goodness, there's a lot of questions, but be patient. Those of you asking questions, I will eventually get to you. Megan asks, can you speculate about the difference between younger and older groups in terms of job boredom? But you mentioned a range of differences where younger people were perhaps more vulnerable. What's going on there? And again, what kind of lessons can we take away in terms of trying to intervene with younger workers?
Do you want to start, Jari?
You may, yeah, please. Me, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Yeah, with this data set, we cannot really go very deep into young people's well-being, but I think, well, people have less work experience, they are less settled with their jobs, there are also newcomers who have started to work during this period, and they have not perhaps met their colleagues at all, only by laptop via these virtual meetings. So this is a real challenge, it may be. And I think for young people, now this is only speculating and we all can speculate, but it seems that what is said about millennials, that what they want, as the psychological contract has changed, companies cannot anymore promise lifelong contracts, or not even for the time being contracts. They are more on fixed term basis. So the psychological contract now says, I would say that young people would expect that they learn a lot. They get their employability improved. They learn from their senior colleagues, from mentors, all this. And there are less possibilities now for that because people don't meet on everyday basis. And perhaps that is one thing that is what young employees particularly are missing now. I'm not sure. what would you add something, Janne?
Yeah, I was also thinking about the importance of social contacts, and perhaps amongst the youngest there are less people who have families, more people who are living by themselves in comparison to the older demographic groups. And as we saw, the people who live by themselves are also doing worse than the people who are not living in a single household. So perhaps those two correlate as well here.
Okay, great, thank you. A number of people have raised the issue of gender. What do your findings say about gender differences, I guess especially in terms of work-life balance and caring responsibilities, etc.?
I think we still need to, yeah, we haven't conducted full analysis of the whole data set because we have many different demographical groups for this, but if I remember correctly, but this needs to be verified that the development has been worse for females, if I remember this right. The first preliminary analysis looked like that, but they still need to be verified.
Okay.
Yeah, but in Finland, perhaps not so big gender differences usually. It's maybe a bit different, and one thing is that females are more employed than men are at the present work life, and they have quite good positions and all this, so it's not egalitarian, but still not so different from men and women. And well, the difference is also that during this COVID period, what we know for sure is that usually when there is economic recession, it's men who get first unemployed, and because they work in construction and industry. But now, because the service sector has particularly suffered, so women have been more likely to lose their job, at least that we know.
Okay, great, thank you. I have a couple of questions on just the design and hypotheses of the survey. David asks, when you did the first wave of the survey before COVID, what were your working hypotheses? What was the initial idea behind the survey? What was really exciting you at that point? And he also asked, do you have a plan for T4 and T5 successive waves of the survey? And is there anything reflecting on your current findings that you would like to add to another wave? Would you add another question or explore other issues as a result of your current reflections on this wave of the survey?
Great questions. Thank you, all of this. First of all, we launched this project. Of course, we didn't know anything about COVID-19. Perhaps nobody knew at that point. But we actually we are validating in Finnish context this new burnout measure developed in Leuven University by Wilma Schoffeli. Some of you may know him. And we wanted to collect data about burnout in general population. That would represent general population. At the same time, we are collecting data from burnout clients of occupational health services, and we try to build kind of clinical cutoff points for burnout, serious level, mild level of burnout, green lights, all this. So that was the starting point, and we thought that at the same time we will study other aspects of employee well-being, so we would have a kind of prevalence picture of employee well-being in Finland. And then we have these company data collections as well, part of this project. So we did not hypothesize as such anything about. Then world changed, and we had this nice possibility to continue, and hopefully it depends on the funding, like everything depends with researchers. Time is money for some people, and money is time for some people. So let's hope we can continue. It would be highly important, I think, to keep on, although the sample size is decreasing gradually all the time, and how can we generalize the findings? It becomes a question more and more, but still we have these nearly 800 people that have been followed up through all these 3 phases. What was the next? Would you like to continue?
Do we have any new questions that we would like to ask in subsequent surveys? Yeah, we haven't yet planned for that. And of course, for longitudinal data, it's important that we ask for the same thing, so we have a follow-up survey, but perhaps there could be some new questions about work characteristics or something like that that we haven't included in the, like Jari presented, the few items that we had about the work characteristics, but perhaps something in that area.
Okay, great, thank you. Sorry, please.
If I may say,
yeah.
Please make suggestions, if you like, participants, what we should really include. Sorry,
okay.
Colin.
Okay, that's great, thank you. Somebody asks, do you have any insight as to whether similar trends have been identified in other European countries? So that's one question. Can I add my question here, which I'd like to ask a question about the Finnish context and the extent to which Finland's model of employment relations, which we think in the UK is perhaps more partnership oriented than we have here in the UK. Does the Finnish welfare state and the Finnish model of employment relations create a specific context where perhaps organizations and employees are more resilient in the face of a crisis like COVID, or do you have any views on that? To what extent is the Finnish model important here?
Oh, very good question, and I think Finns would say we don't have anything special, we only have problems, and we cannot be the happiest country in the world, how miserable it can be elsewhere. That is how we Finns think about this, but I think there is like trade unions, they fight with each other in public and all this, but at the same time they collaborate with the issues of quality of work life. They really collaborate, and there is this kind of a negotiation system and building better organizations. What is special also in Finland, we have all the time, all governments always launch a new well-being related national program, which I like. It has really limited resources, but it still keeps the discussion going on, and it attracts many organizations and people. And now we have like 2030 work-life program just about to start that is coordinated by our institute. I think these are important. These are that we have kind of consensus also that employee well-being is an important issue. And actually, of course, I don't know about other countries, but perhaps in the Netherlands, but in addition to Finland, in public media, there is so much talk about burnout and also about engagement that I don't know how is it in your country about that it's in the news, it's in the women's magazines, it's all over this discussion about well-being, and I think it's good. People are at least more aware of. And I think by that we change the culture somehow, that it becomes more and more difficult to be, for example, a really bad leader. There are, of course, a lot of bad leaders in Finland, a lot of badly run companies, but you need to work harder to stay that way and to justify that way of working. That is perhaps something special in Finland, slightly special.
Okay, great point, thank you. Some more definitional challenges or issues here. In terms of what you mean by teleworking, do you mean teleworking as being all people who have been required to work at home using technology because of COVID, or do you differentiate between people who previously did telework, and are there any differences between those groups? Could you start by just defining those terms, and are you able to pull apart those differences between those forced to work from home and those who it's kind of part of their job?
Perhaps I can respond to this one. So in our questionnaire for the second survey, we ask whether the amount of teleworking time has increased. So by that, we were able to catch people who reported that they increasingly teleworked. And in these results, we have the group teleworkers. So people who responded at time 2, that their teleworking time increased, and who also teleworked at the very least 75% of their working time by telecommuting at time 2 and at time 3. So they switched to more teleworking, did most of the time by telecommuting at both time points. So those were the people who teleworked. And for the people who didn't telework, we included those who responded that their teleworking time did not increase and did maximum less than one of 25% by telecommuting. So by this, we were able to separate. But of course, then we have the context. In COVID-19, teleworking usually means working from home. It's less about working in other shared offices or cafes, but we don't know where exactly people teleworked. But we can quite surely come to that conclusion from the context. And of course, in COVID, it was quite important to also measure the switch to telework, as it was a major phenomenon in Finland and of course across Europe as well and in many other countries. So we were able to catch that as well.
Okay, great, thank you. A kind of linked question relates to how you define it and who are these non-teleworkers. So Sarah asks, who are these non-teleworkers in your sample? I guess because of furlough here in the UK, most people who are out there working but are not furloughed, there's a group of people who would be key workers, as we would call them, or critical workers. So who do you think is in this non-teleworker sample? And is it skewed towards key workers or critical workers?
Yeah, as we have this general population data, so they represent very different professions, but on average, they are less educated than those who move to telework. So they are more in services, in industries, or this kind of, but they also quite evenly work in public or in the private sector. So that was not so big issue, but they are less educated, more in service functions. And would you add, Janne, something? But I think this kind of profile.
Yeah, but of course, yeah, like Jari, you mentioned, there's a huge variety of different occupations amongst the respondents, of course, as we have a population sample, so there's no simple. But in terms service sector, yes, perhaps the largest.
Okay, thank you. Jana asks, could you tell us a bit more about changing organizational identification and how this might be attributed to the effects of COVID? So is it about COVID as an experience, or can it be attributed to changing organizational practices? What do you think is happening in terms of movement and organizational identification?
Yeah, this is quite interesting, and I'm also happy that we happen to measure also this kind of a sense of belonging to the organization. So it shares some definitional similarities as commitment, but it's more about your identity being part of this social group, which is your employer or the organization. So usually what we know from, and it's also interesting that it hasn't changed that much in the mean levels during the COVID-19. So there hasn't been, as you could also expect there to be a big decrease, especially amongst teleworkers, but that's not what our data shows, I believe. So that's also interesting that people still have the sense of belonging to the organization, even that they don't see other people that much. Of course, the organization, perhaps it's quite abstract entity. Of course, it depends on the organization. So perhaps the identification with your team members has gone downward, whereas the organizational sense of belonging has still been more or less the same. So the work characteristics usually define, and one of the key predictors is usually whether I feel that I'm treated fairly or not. So the justice aspect is the main driver of organizational identification in general. And I think that also applies to COVID-19 situation. So perhaps it speaks quite positively how workplaces have managed this transition, that people have also felt that they have been treated quite fairly as well. But
okay.
it still needs to be more studied and analyzed, our data as well.
Okay, great. I'm sorry about that. I think a lot of these questions are basically saying, can you do more research and can you ask different questions? But I think
we will.
that's usually a good sign of a very interesting project. I think this is another of those type of questions. Lucas asks, do you have insights about the changing role of management and how that impacts on people working from home? I know you have some data on people feeling supported by their leaders, but do you have other questions or insights just generally about how management practice has responded to COVID, and could that be a factor here?
Yes, certainly. I think Finnish, like all workplaces, are very different in this respect. What I know, but with this data set, we cannot really go much deeper than this with leadership issues. But then we have these other projects, but we have not been able to analyze the results yet. But there we measure many different kind of organizational resources, servant leadership and justice and organizational, but also supervisor identification and all this, so we can answer to that better later. But of course, they are important aspects, how to stay in touch with your employees. And I think those workplaces where it has been on a regular basis already before COVID-19, that you have this sense of justice and good relationship with your bosses, then it must have been easier way to go through this special year than to start from the thing that you control employees, you don't allow people to work at home, and now can you really trust, or do you try to keep on controlling? And I think workplaces are very different in that respect. I don't know, how would you discuss this, Janne? Would you add something?
No, yeah, not really, but yeah, I also see that the switch to teleworking has perhaps emphasized also the change in leadership from being a controlling leadership to more empowering leadership, and making sure that the employees are feeling well and their well-being is at high levels and that they are engaged at work rather than controlling. And from engagement comes the performance and the outputs.
Okay, fantastic. I think this is kind of the same question, but I'm going to invite you to expand a little further. I think Paul and Xanthi ask a similar question that I think I'm going to try and capture here. And the question is essentially, what is going on in the 62.3% of your pie chart? I think that's what these two questions are really asking, that a lot of what's going on here is around organizational characteristics, perhaps changes in the assumptions of how organizations function. So one is a methodological question. Can you break down the subcomponents of these changes in work characteristics? And can you just describe a little bit about what you think, what's really important in that 62.3%, the changes in work characteristics box?
Okay, yes, let's see. We only these are all measured with one item, these changes in work. So that's a limitation. Of course, these are good items, good questions, validated, but still it's only one. And when I look at the changes, okay, to what direction? So in this data set, it was like 50 to 60% that said that there were no changes in identification with one's workplace or justice or insecurity. But then it split quite evenly to those who said that reported improvement in justice and identification and a decrease in security, and the other quarter or 20% reported the vice versa. So there were both developments to both directions. But then what really happened, I don't know. Perhaps in those workplaces where things get to better, organizations, leaders paid more attention immediately to this issue. This is now a real challenge. How do we, well, not only how do we take care of employees who have to move at home, not only they are allowed, but have to work, they are forced to telework, but also how to take care of the businesses. We don't discuss so much, we discuss the leader's role, how to lead people, which is very nice and important, but also one of the responsibilities of the leaders has been also how to take care that we can run business, that we still have employees and workplaces. And some have been more proactive in this sense or more adaptive in that sense, and increased contacts, find better ways to stay in touch, perhaps have very not so officially taking in touch with the employees, but also a bit more unofficially asking how are you and all these kind of things. Whereas others, I don't know, now I talk about from my experience that some people then complain that leaders have vanished altogether. I can be by myself, I can be very autonomous, I don't hear anything about my bosses, which at normal times could be very nice for some employees, but under these conditions when there's a lot of insecurity and what to do, it might not be that good strategy to vanish.
Okay, thank you. We have 4 minutes. I'm going to try and squeeze in 2 questions, and for those of you who have not had an answer, we'll perhaps share those questions with Jari and Janne, and we can maybe write a blog or something at a later date that covers the rest of the questions. So I said there's a range of people in the room, and here's a very foundational question. Why use work engagement as a concept? As you, Jari and Janne, perhaps know, here in the UK, employee engagement is bandied around and is defined in many different ways, and some more dubious and not so well defined than others. In one sentence, can you tell us why work engagement is a good model or concept to help us understand what's going on here?
Can I answer? Because
yes,
I love the concept of work engagement. It's the best possible state of well-being at work, and especially they hit something, Wilmer Schauffele and Arnold Parker, when they developed this measure. There is so much evidence, longitudinal, objective, registered-based data. We have just about to publish one study which shows that it also predicts less unemployment, less disability pensions, and raise in wages and occupational rankings. And it seems to be that it hits something very important. It's kind of a proactive well-being state that is captured with this construct. I know there's a lot of other employee engagement indicators, measures, but I like this also because it distinguishes from performance, which is sometimes included. Also, it is a consequence of commitment, not part of it is commitment. So this is what I can say, but I could talk about 2 hours of this. Thanks for the question.
That was a very nice and concise answer. I'm going to do my own little plug here and say to anyone who's asking out there that my own team uses the concept of work engagement to explore the relationship between job enrichment and job resources and well-being and performance outcomes amongst your employees. If you would like us to work with you on those issues, we're delighted to help. Sorry for the little plug. My last question. If you had one message to managers within organizations in terms of how to help their people manage the well-being impacts of the COVID crisis, what would your message be?
Would you, Janne, like to have the final word?
Ask how they are doing and how could I help you?
Yeah. Take care of yourself, take care of your employees, be human, be humble. Have mercy.
Okay, those are great notes to end on. Thank you, Janne and Jari, for a fantastic talk. Apologies to those of you who I didn't get round to in the questions. As I was saying, if it's okay with Jari and Janne, I'll write something up and we can maybe write a blog that captures any further responses. I'm seeing them nodding, so they seem to be open to this idea. So thank you again, Jari and Janne. Thank you for everyone participating in today's webinar. This is the first, and it's been a great start, it's the first in a series of international research webinars that the PrOPEL Hub will be hosting. Visit propelhub.org if you wish to find out further information. That information has also just been placed in the message bar. And with that, I would like to say once again, kiitos to our Finnish colleagues and to everyone who joined us, and thank you for a very stimulating presentation. Thanks again for joining us.